YouTube Fronks, welcome back to another complete guide, this time covering the return of our favorite drunk bard, Venti. Kinda crazy how I've never made a complete guide for Venti until now, even though he's been out since the release of the game in 1.0 as the first limited banner character. Better late than never, I suppose. As most of you are probably fairly familiar with how he works, this guide will aim to reinforce info you already know, without taking too much of your time, covering additional nuances that are important to Venti himself. If you're new here, first off, welcome to the channel and appreciate you dropping by. I also stream most nights on Twitch, so feel free to check out my community over there and their chaotic chill vibes. Link in the description. Alright, let's begin. Timestamps are provided for your convenience. First off, a breakdown of two different but equally viable builds. We have a baseline of level 80 out of 80, Constellation 0, and 188 talents. First off, we have the most common build, which is a pure Elemental Mastery build. Here, I prefer running Stringless at R5 with this Elemental Mastery build alongside 4 Iridescent Venerer set that looks like follows. These pieces are Elemental Mastery focused for his swirls, which don't utilize crit stats, so trying to glean energy recharge wherever possible. Overall stats look like: we aim for maximum Elemental Mastery here for swirl-based damage, not focusing on the crit stats and maintaining decent recharge. And here's a second build, which is a high investment required DPS build, running attack % timepiece, Anemo damage goblet, and a crit-based mask. This build is stronger the better quality your artifacts are, which generally is pretty tough to achieve for the average player, which is why I would recommend the other Elemental Mastery build first. For this crit build, the weapon of choice is the 5-star Skyward Harp, which provides high base attack, crit rate, and crit damage to smooth out his ratios. Artifact substats and his Ascension stat will provide the energy recharge necessary for his rotations. Again, this build is extremely high-end build and is much more expensive to build than the Elemental Mastery build, so most players will immediately default to triple Elemental Mastery, which is a familiar build for Anemo support characters. With this particular build, the stats look like follows: decent attack, crit rate crit damage of 66 to 220, and then 140 recharge, along with 61.6 Anemo damage bonus. For this complete guide though, we'll be anchoring our discussion surrounding the triple Elemental Mastery build. Okay, so this ties into what I would recommend your Venti to aim for. Universal stats, level 80 out of 90. I would recommend actually ascending to 90, even though I don't have it, for his energy recharge ascension stat. For the talents, I would recommend 168 at the very minimum, because his burst is his whole kit. Artifacts, 4 Iridescent Venerer, no matter which build you go. And for Constellation, C0 is perfectly fine. Now for split builds specifically, for the triple Elemental Mastery build, artifacts are obviously going to be triple EM main stat timepiece, goblet, and mask. The weapon, prioritizing Stringless or the Windbloom Ode from the Windbloom Festival for max Elemental Mastery, and then Elegy would be the 5-star option for this particular build. If you do opt for the DPS build, then the artifacts will follow a standard DPS build of attack, Anemo goblet, and then crit-based mask. And then weapons, Stringless is still really powerful for this build. Alley Hunter is a great one because he doesn't have much on-field time. Skyward Harp for generic stat distribution. We'll get into more details when we hit those sections. So, how does Venti work? Get the basics out of the way. Normal attack, I guess used for physical Venti memes if you want to do that. Charge shot, used for those Anemo totem things you gotta light up for puzzles and stuff. Funny thing is, I got this Anemoculus by flying from the top of Storm Terror without using this totem, so now it's stuck like this in my world. Elemental skill, the tap version. This is the most common usage of this skill in battle, provides a nice shotgun of AoE Anemo damage, lifts enemies up, and provides 3 particles on a very short 6-second cooldown. Multiplier at level 8 at 442% is pretty nice considering the low cooldown. Now, the hold version. This is usually used for exploration, but in battle does deal about 35% more damage than the tab version, generates an updraft, which is from his A1 passive, and only generates 4 particles on a 15-second cooldown. Onto his burst. So if you don't know how powerful this ability is, I like to describe it like so. Venti's burst can't be used everywhere, but where it can be used to group up enemies, he does it better than anyone else in the game without question. So essentially, he fires a fixed distance away from himself and generates what's called a Storm Eye that acts like a black hole and sucks everything lightweight and small into the epicenter above the ground. This ability also infuses the first element that it comes in contact to, dealing additional damage of that element type. 20 ticks of the main DOT and about 15 ticks of the additional element one. So overall, you can expect the raw damage from his burst to be about 1500%, not including all the swirls that he can pull off. With a cooldown of 15 seconds and an energy cost of 60, alongside his Ascension 4 passive talent, which refunds 15 flat energy when his burst ends, and his energy recharge ascension stat, he basically has zero energy issues for his burst. So his burst is the reason why two builds can exist. Either you triple elemental mastery build to maximize the swirl base damage and then just utilize this base damage, or you can do the DPS build that maximizes this DOT and additional element damage and then forgoes the swirl damage. Both builds work. Alright, passive talent. So Ascension 1 talent, as we mentioned, Hold E generates an updraft for 20 seconds. This is mostly useful for exploration. Ascension 4 talent, 15 flat energy for Venti himself, and to all of the party members of the same element that was infused in his burst. So, for example, if Venti's burst swirled Pyro, then all your Pyro teammates would get 15 flat energy back when Venti's burst ends. And finally, talent priority. This should be no surprise, with Elemental Burst taking highest priority, and then Elemental Skill. Normal attack is not used. Elemental Burst definitely deserves level 8 or higher. Alright then, quick notes on optimizing his playstyle. So since Venti's burst fires through the first enemy on contact, make sure to position such that where the burst ends up is the center of the enemies. And due to auto-target, you'll likely have to improvise based on where the enemies are. Second, his elemental skill end animation can be cancelled with his burst, so tap E into Q is often muscle memory and best practice for Venti players. Since his tap E is a really short 6-second cooldown, quick swap teams make use of short swaps to Venti to stall for ability uptime by using his tap E for damage and for particle generation. And then for larger enemies that can't be fully pulled in, they still may be slowly gathered in. Freeze can assist with this, preventing their movements from getting out and maximizing Venti's burst utility. However, don't forget that against larger enemies and single target bosses, Venti's strength may be dampened significantly. Utilizing him where he shines the best, which is most AoE situations plus light small enemies that can be grouped up, will provide the most satisfying results. Now that we've covered his gameplay essentials, let's throw a weapon on him. Given that Venti has been a part of the game since day one, I'm going to restrict his weapon roster to the most optimal and recommended for either build. And to simplify visual comparisons, I'll demonstrate what to expect from Venti's burst from both an Elemental Mastery build and a crit build with a selective preferred weapon from each side. So, for the Elemental Mastery build, most common usage and what I would recommend to aspiring Venti users, Stringless at R1 to R5. This is for my veteran F2P gamers or budget gacha gamers and above. This is the strongest and highest efficiency Elemental Mastery weapon, but it's only available by the gacha. Veteran F2Ps should have at least one of these, so at least R1. Then, Windbloom Ode R5. This is the free event bow if you played it during the 1.4 Windbloom Festival. Has the same Elemental Mastery as the Stringless. Raven Bow R5. This is for my new F2P gamers out there. It's a 3-star bow that has Elemental Mastery on the secondary stat, a good starting point for a cost-efficient build. And finally, for the Elemental Mastery bows, we have Elegy at R1. This is a 5-star bow with a mixture of Elemental Mastery, Recharge, and a team buff of Elemental Mastery and attack percent. Alright, moving on to the crit build. So this is the high investment dedicated Venti burst DPS build. I would not recommend this for the average player, as it requires very high artifact quality to be substantially better than the Elemental Mastery build. We have Skyward Harp at R1 or higher. This is for my lucky F2P players up there, all the way to the whales. This is the strongest crit build option with high base attack, good crit rate, and good crit damage. Also have some other 5-star weapons, Thundering Pulse and Polar Star. These are 5-star stat stick options if not using on anyone else in your roster. Then we have the Stringless at R5. Universally strong Venti bow, has a 48% elemental skill and burst damage with no caveats. Then we have Alejandra at R5. This trades the Elemental Mastery secondary that the Stringless has for an attack percent secondary. The passive is essentially 40% burst damage, assuming that you're off-field long enough. Now those weapons are really it. Any weapon or weapon refinement below what I just mentioned, I would not recommend for the crit Venti build. Okay, so here's what an Elemental Mastery build with the Stringless R5, and then a crit build with the Skyward at R1 looks like. I'll be using the same teams for both. I'll be using Kokomi and Yaimiko strictly for elemental application for Hydro and Electro to proc his swirls. Relevant stats will be displayed for both of these demonstrations. So as you can see, there are a lot of numbers on the screen. So instead of calculating all of this in the total damage output, instead let's pay attention to the remaining HP of the enemies. In both demonstrations, the enemies are left with relatively similar HP. However, it's fairly evident that the crit build needs some insane stats to match the Elemental Mastery build. It is of course doable and can outscale with optimal gear setups. However, it is extremely expensive compared to the Elemental Mastery build like I mentioned, which is why I recommend Elemental Mastery build for most players. On to artifacts. I'm going to assume that you have 4 of your Inventor or are working on it. If you are a new player, consider placeholder Elemental Mastery pieces to start, like Wanderer's Troop 2-piece and Instructor's 2 to 4-piece. For the main stats, I would say that his setups are fairly straightforward. For the 95% of you who will be using the Elemental Mastery build, run triple Elemental Mastery main stat. Commit all the way because swirls don't scale off of attack or crit, only off of character level and Elemental Mastery. Alternative is EM Anemo EM, with Anemo for the Goblet if you don't have Elemental Mastery Goblet yet. And the other side, the 5% of you who will be running a crit build. These are standard DPS main stats, running attack timepiece, Anemo Goblet, and a crit rate or crit damage mask. Recharge timepiece is not necessary at all. His Ascension 4 passive and Energy Recharge Ascension talent are sufficient for his 60 cost burst. Run a crit damage mask if you manage to hit 65 or higher crit rate by only substats and the weapon. Otherwise, run a crit rate mask. Randomated stat values for both builds. So, for the Elemental Mastery build, I would aim for 750 or higher Elemental Mastery. 700 of that usually comes from the weapon, like the Stringless or the Windbloom Ode, plus triple Elemental Mastery artifacts, which each give 187. And then 140% energy recharge, where 24 to 32 of it comes from the Ascension stat. For the crit build, 1.5k plus attack, 70% crit rate, 150% crit damage, or 200% plus crit damage with a crit-based weapon, like Skyward Heart for example, and then 140% energy recharge. And yes, those crit stats need to be that high for substantial strength over the Elemental Mastery build. The crit build that I demonstrated was 66 crit rate with 217 crit damage with an R1 Harp. If you hit these thresholds for either Elemental Mastery build or a crit build, I would say that your Venti is pretty solid. Alright, Constellations. So, TLDR, all you need is Constellation 0. His Constellations are mostly just for Anemo damage buffs, which, to his credit, are actually fairly strong if you need them. Constellation 1. Bro, this Constellation's whack, not gonna lie. It gets a pass because he's the first banner character and you can meme that you have a shotgun Venti, but given that this is an actual 5-star Archon Constellation, come on. Constellation 2. Elemental skill reduces enemies' Anemo Fizz Res by 24%, 12% from the standard ability, and then 12% when they're launched. Constellation 3 and Constellation 5 are +3 levels to his skills, nothing special about these. Constellation 4. Venti gains a 25% Anemo damage bonus. He must be on field to collect the orb though. It's like Jean's Constellation 2 if you guys have tried attack speed comps like that. And then Constellation 6. This is more Anemo res decrease, this time via his burst. Combined with Constellation 2, he technically has a 44% Anemo resistance shred. 20% shred also to another element infused, which stacks with the Iridescent Venerer. And that's about it. As I mentioned, his Constellations are mostly for Anemo damage buffs. Alright, for team comps condensed and to the point. Venti enables certain characters to have extremely good scaling, and if the situation presents itself, provides some of the easiest AoE wipe options the game has to offer. Characters like Ganyu and Tartag are most well known for their quadratic scaling against grouped enemies. Ganyu's burst has pseudo-random targeting that allows focus firing if those targets are all in the same space. Tartag has its unique Riptide mechanics that offer insane AoE Hydro procs the more enemies are in the same vicinity. I believe I covered this concept for both these characters in their own specific guides. And lesser known, Albedo's Transient Blossoms also share the pseudo-random targeting for focused AoE geodamage if enemies are grouped. However, this is less well known and usually not used as often due to lack of swirl synergy. With 2.6, we now have Ayato that shares pseudo-random targeting in his burst like Ganyu, and will be amplified quite well with Venti's burst. The most well-known OG team featuring Venti in these mechanics is the Morgana team. Originally composed of Mona, Ganyu, and Diona, and Venti, this freeze team introduced a staple of ridiculously high AoE damage, crowd control, energy refund, and survivability with autopilot and ease of play. With more cryo characters and Hydro Glue entering the roster, this team is very flexible and builds around Venti's burst to maximize its viability. Besides these staples though, Venti himself can act as a standalone unit in whatever comp that needs his AoE. He serves as a great energy refunder with his Storm Eye, and does what he does against big groups of liftable enemies better than anyone else in the game. Alright, it's showcase time. We have clips from the current Abyss and Old Abyss and the Iridescent Venerer dungeon, which is the OG Venti playground. Situations where he shines the most. Cue the music, Mr. Goat. And with the showcase complete, that about wraps up the core of this guide. With access to one powerful burst, against liftable groups of enemies, Venti nullifies them with unrivaled power. If this guide helped you understand Venti a little better, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's free and really helps the video get recommended and reach a broader audience. Thanks for watching, and I wish that everyone still trying to pull Venti the best of luck. We'll see you on the next one. Take care.